The San Juan Mountains of Colorado stretched like a fortress of stone and shadow, their peaks clawing at the heavens, while dense forests guarded secrets older than memory. In this wild expanse, where the wind sang of survival and solitude, the wilderness was both a sanctuary and a challenge, indifferent to those who dared to call it home. Tucked into a quiet valley, where a meadow met a wall of ponderosa pines, stood a weathered cedar cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of countless winters. This was the refuge of Elias Carter, a 70-year-old widower whose life had been carved by the rhythms of these mountains. His face, lined like the bark of the trees outside, bore the marks of a man who'd faced nature's highs and lows, blizzards that buried trails, summers that bloomed with wildflowers, and a grief that had nearly broken him. 8 years ago, Elias had lost his wife, Clara, to a cancer that moved faster than the doctor's promises. Her laughter, once the heartbeat of their home, had faded, leaving a silence Elias couldn't outrun. He'd retired from his Forest Service job soon after, trading ranger stations and paperwork for this remote cabin where the nearest town was a winding hour's drive away. Here he could tend his small garden, chop firewood, and let the mountains teach him how to live with loss. His only companion was Mabel, a 10-year-old French bulldog with a brindle coat and a personality as unyielding as the granite cliffs beyond the meadow. Mabel's bat-like ears caught every rustle, but her days of chasing squirrels were long gone. Now she claimed the quilt by the wood stove as her throne, her snores a steady comfort in the quiet nights when memories of Clara pressed too close. This autumn morning, the air held a bite that whispered of change. Elias stood at the cabin's lone window, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands as he studied the sky. The San Juans were restless today, their peaks shrouded in a mist that swirled like ghosts among the ridges. Dawn painted the meadow in muted golds, but the forest beyond was silent. No chickadees trilled, no squirrels chattered from the branches. Elias had spent decades reading the wild's moods, first as a ranger patrolling trails, then as a retiree, who knew every deer path around his property. This stillness wasn't just the calm before a storm. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. "Getting spooky out there, Mabel," he said, glancing at the dog sprawled across her quilt. Mabel opened one eye, her wrinkled face unimpressed, then let out a huff that shook her jowls. At her age, Mabel's priorities were simple: warmth, a bowl of kibble, and the occasional scratch behind her ears. Elias smiled, the sound of his own voice a small rebellion against the quiet, but the unease lingered, prickling his skin like the first drops of a coming rain. The forecast had warned of a storm, 3 days of wet snow or sleet, the kind that could strand a man if he wasn't ready. Elias needed to check the generator, haul in firewood, and make sure the cabin's shutters could withstand the wind. The San Juans didn't forgive carelessness. He drained his coffee and set the mug on the counter, its chipped rim a reminder of Clara's clumsy hands. She'd always teased him about keeping ugly things too long. Pulling on a flannel jacket, its elbows patched from years of use, Elias laced up his boots. The leather was worn soft, molded to his feet by countless miles across these mountains. "Won't be long, old girl," he told Mabel, giving her a pat. She didn't stir, her snores rumbling as he opened the door. The air outside was sharp, laced with the scent of pine and the faint metallic tang of snow. His breath puffed in clouds as he crossed the yard to the woodshed, his boots sinking into a carpet of needles. The meadow glowed faintly, its wildflowers fading with the season, while the forest loomed dark and silent, its secrets hidden in shadow. Elias had stacked half a dozen logs when a sound stopped him cold, a faint, high-pitched whimper, so soft he thought he'd imagined it. He straightened, his back creaking from years of hauling gear and clearing trails, and tilted his head to listen. There it was again, sharper now, drifting from the tree line where the pines swallowed the light. It wasn't a fox's cry or the bleat of a lost fawn. It sounded almost like a puppy, though that seemed impossible. The nearest neighbor, Old Man Hargrove, lived 7 miles down the valley, and he kept goats, not dogs. Elias's brow furrowed as he set down a log, the rough bark catching on his gloves. "Wind playing tricks?" he muttered. but his feet were already moving. He'd learned to trust his gut in these mountains, where a single misstep could turn deadly. The whimper came again, weaker, tugging at something deep inside him. A memory of Clara, her voice soft. As she nursed an injured hawk back to health, her hands steady despite the bird's sharp talons, Elias scanned the forest's edge, his eyes tracing the shadows between trunks. The storm clouds were thickening, their edges bruised and heavy, but he couldn't ignore the sound. It was small, scared, and alone, a plea that cut through the silence like a blade. He glanced back at the cabin where Mabel's silhouette appeared at the window, her nose pressed to the glass as if she'd finally sensed his absence. The woodshed stood half-filled, the generator unchecked, but Elias knew. He couldn't turn back. Not yet. He adjusted his jacket, the flannel soft against his neck, and stepped toward the trees. The whimper called again, faint but insistent, guiding him like a thread through the vastness of the San Juans. In a world where survival often hinged on instinct, something needed him, and Elias Carter, for all his years and scars, wasn't the kind of man to walk away. 2 days before Elias Carter heard the faint whimper in the San Juan Mountains, a battered gray sedan rattled along a narrow Forest Service road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust that clung to the pines. The road, barely maintained, wound through the densest part of the wilderness, far from the paved highways and scattered cabins of the valley below. Behind the wheel was Tara Winslow, a woman in her late 20s whose hands gripped the steering wheel with a desperation that matched the tremor in her breath. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping to frame a face pale with exhaustion. The dashboard clock blinked 6:47 p.m., its red glow casting shadows across her bloodshot eyes that hadn't known proper sleep in weeks. In the back seat, secured by a fraying seatbelt, sat a plastic pet carrier, its vents revealing glimpses of movement inside. A tiny French Bulldog puppy, no more than 7 weeks old, pressed its cream-colored nose against the slats, its dark eyes wide and confused. The puppy's coat was soft but matted, its small frame thinner than it should have been, ribs faintly visible beneath the skin. It let out a soft whine, a sound that carried both hunger and hope, as if it sensed the world beyond the carrier might hold comfort. Tara's jaw tightened at the noise, her knuckles whitening. "Quiet, you," she snapped, her voice sharp but brittle, like glass about to shatter. The puppy whimpered again, undeterred, its tiny paws scrabbling against the plastic. Tara's life hadn't always been this jagged. 6 months ago, she'd been scraping by in Durango, working double shifts at a diner, and dreaming of a fresh start. The puppy had been an impulse, a gift from a co-worker who'd bred her French Bulldog and couldn't keep the litter. Tara had named it nothing, called it the pup, or sometimes just you, as if naming it would tether her to a responsibility she couldn't afford. She'd thought it would be easy, feed it, walk it, love it. But love didn't pay vet bills or buy kibble when tips were lean, and the puppy's needs had grown louder than her bank account could answer. The shelter in town wanted a surrender, fee she didn't have, and her landlord had threatened eviction if the puppy's yapping didn't stop. So here she was, driving into the wilderness with a plan she hated but couldn't unthink. The sedan lurched to a stop at a small turnout, where the road widened just enough for a vehicle to pull over. The engine sputtered, then fell silent, leaving only the puppy's soft cries and the distant call of an owl. Tara sat frozen, staring at the darkening forest beyond the windshield. The pines loomed like sentinels, their branches swaying in a breeze that carried the first chill of night. She glanced at the carrier in the rearview mirror, catching the puppy's gaze, those trusting eyes so unaware of the betrayal unfolding. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, shoving down the guilt that clawed at her chest. "Come. On, Tara, you've got no choice," she muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. She stepped out, the gravel crunching under her sneakers, and opened the back door. The pet carrier rattled as she yanked it free, the puppy tumbling inside with a startled yelp. She set it on the ground, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch. The door sprang open, and the French Bulldog puppy stumbled out, its legs wobbly on the uneven earth. It looked up at her, tail wagging hesitantly, as if waiting for a game or a treat. Its bat-like ears twitched, catching the rustle. of leaves, but it didn't run. It stayed close, trusting her despite the hunger gnawing at its belly. "This is better," Tara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone'll find you. A hiker, maybe. Or you'll—" She didn't finish, couldn't. The words felt like poison, too heavy to spit out. The puppy tilted its head, letting out a small, hopeful bark that pierced her like a knife. "Don't do that," she snapped, stepping back. "Don't look at me like you understand." She turned toward the car, her boots dragging as if the ground itself were pulling her back. The puppy took a tentative step after her, whining softly, and Tara's resolve cracked for a moment. She almost reached down, almost scooped it up. But then she thought of the eviction notice, the empty fridge, the life she was barely holding. Together. The car door slammed, the sound echoing through the trees like a gunshot. Tara slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she turned the key. The engine roared to life, drowning out the puppy's first frightened yelp as she pulled away. In the side mirror, she caught a glimpse of the tiny creature standing, alone in the turnout, its cream coat glowing faintly in the twilight. Then the road curved, and it was gone. Tara pressed her lips together, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. "It's better this way," she told herself, the lie settling like ash in her mouth. The sedan disappeared down the mountain, its taillights fading into the dark. The puppy sat trembling in the turnout, its small body dwarfed by the towering pines. Night fell swiftly, wrapping the forest in a cold that seeped into its bones. Hunger, sharper now, drove it to move, though it had no sense of where to go. Its instincts, untested and raw, urged it to seek shelter, warmth, anything that felt like the human hands it had once known. Stumbling over roots and stones, it wandered deeper into the wilderness, its whimpers growing fainter as fear tightened its grip. By midnight, it found a hollow beneath a moss-covered rock, barely big enough to shield its shivering frame. It curled into a ball, nose tucked under its stubby tail, and cried out, a sound so weak it barely reached the nearest tree. The forest swallowed the noise, indifferent as ever, but the puppy's cries didn't go entirely unheard. Not far away, hidden in the shadows, something stirred, a presence that belonged to the wild, its senses attuned to every sound in the night. The French bulldog, alone and abandoned, had no way of knowing that its fate was about to intertwine with a creature no one would expect. In the vast San Juans, where cruelty could break a life, something extraordinary was waiting to mend it. In the shadowed heart of the San Juan Mountains, where moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy of pines, the wilderness pulsed with life both fierce and fragile. Not far from the moss-covered rock where the abandoned French bulldog puppy huddled, a female bobcat moved silently through the underbrush. At 4 years old, she was a master of her domain, her tawny coat dappled with spots that blended seamlessly with the forest's patchwork of light and shadow. Her amber eyes glowed faintly in the dark, sharp and unyielding, while her compact, muscular frame spoke of a hunter honed by survival. She was a mother, too, her den, a sheltered nook beneath, a granite overhang, home to 2 kittens born in the warmth of early summer. Now 5 months old, they were beginning to test their claws, but they still relied on her skill to fill their bellies and her vigilance to keep them safe. The bobcat's territory was rich with prey, rabbits that darted through the meadows, mice that scurried beneath leaves, squirrels too slow to escape her pounce. This abundance had allowed her to keep her den closer to the forest's edge than most of her kind, a choice that balanced risk with reward. Tonight, as she slipped from her shelter to hunt, her kitten's soft mews followed her, demanding food she'd soon provide. Her ears twitched, catching the rustle of a vole in the distance, but another sound stopped her mid-step, a faint, plaintive whimper that didn't belong to the night's familiar chorus. It was high-pitched, weak, and oddly familiar, stirring, a memory of her smallest kitten, who'd wandered too far a month ago and returned shivering after a night alone. The bobcat's tail flicked, her whiskers vibrating as she processed the anomaly. This wasn't her young, but it called to something deep within her, a pull she couldn't ignore. With the grace of a shadow, she altered her path, moving toward the sound. Her paws made no sound on the pine needles, her body low and fluid as she navigated roots and boulders. The whimper grew clearer, guiding her to a small hollow where a fallen log leaned against a mossy rock. She paused, nostrils flaring. As she sampled the air, the scent was wrong. Not the musky warmth of her kittens or the earthy tang of prey, but something foreign, tinged with a sweetness she associated with the world of humans. Her instincts bristled, urging caution. Humans were danger, their scents, tied to traps and loud machines that tore through the forest. Yet the whimper came again, so feeble it seemed to fade even as she listened, and it tugged at a place beyond logic, a mother's heart that knew the sound of need, no matter the source. Peering into the hollow, the bobcat's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and there it was, a tiny creature, no bigger than her own young, curled into a trembling ball. The French bulldog puppy's cream-colored coat was streaked with dirt, its bat-like, ears drooping as it let out another weak cry. Its ribs pressed against its sides, and its dark eyes, half closed with exhaustion, flickered with a fading spark of hope. To the bobcat, it should have been prey, small, defenseless, an easy meal, to carry back to her den. Her claws flexed instinctively, her body tensing as hunger and habit warred with something else. The puppy stirred, sensing her presence, and managed a faint wag of its stubby tail, a gesture so trusting it caught her off guard. It wasn't her kitten, but it was alone, and its size, its helplessness, mirrored the vulnerability of her own. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her amber gaze locked on the puppy. Every rule of her world told her to walk away or to strike. Predators didn't nurture what they didn't birth. Compassion was a luxury the wild couldn't afford. Yet the whimper pierced her again, and something shifted. Perhaps it was the echo of her own kitten's cries, or the way the puppy's eyes held hers, unafraid despite its fragility. With a slow, deliberate movement, the bobcat stepped closer, her nose twitching as she inhaled the puppy's scent. It was alien but not threatening. She lowered her head, her rough tongue brushing the puppy's matted fur in a gesture that surprised even her. A grooming lick, the kind she gave her own young to soothe and claim them. The puppy went still, its body relaxing under her touch, instinct telling it to trust this warmth. The bobcat's decision came not from thought, but from a deeper force, one that transcended the boundaries of species. With the same gentle precision she used for her kittens, she gripped the puppy by the scruff of its neck, her teeth careful not to pierce the delicate skin. The French bulldog went limp, a reflex bred into canines wild and tame, surrendering to her care. Lifting it as easily as a leaf, she turned and melted back into the forest, her steps swift but steady, carrying her strange cargo toward her den. The journey was short but perilous, the night alive with the eyes of other predators, owls that hunted from above, coyotes that roamed the ridges. The bobcat's senses stayed sharp, her ears swiveling for any threat, but she didn't falter. When she reached the granite overhang, her kittens greeted her with eager mews, their spotted bodies tumbling over each other in anticipation of food. She paused at the den's entrance, setting the puppy down on a bed of dry grass and leaves. The kittens froze, their blue-gold eyes wide with curiosity as they sniffed the newcomer. The puppy, revived slightly by the movement, struggled to its feet, its tail wagging weakly as it sensed other warm bodies. To it they meant safety, companionship, perhaps even food. The bobcat watched closely, her tail twitching as her kittens approached. The larger of the two, a bold male, nudged the puppy's side, earning a soft yip that made him jump back. His sister, more cautious, circled slowly, her nose twitching as she processed the strange scent. They didn't hiss or strike. Their youth made them open to this oddity in their world. The puppy, too weak to play, leaned against the male kitten, and to the bobcat's surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he licked its ear, mimicking their mother's grooming. The bobcat's tension eased, and she settled beside them, her rough tongue resuming its work on the puppy's coat, cleaning away the dirt of its ordeal. As dawn crept through the trees, the unlikely family huddled together in the den's warmth. The puppy, surrounded by the vibrating purrs of the bobcat kittens, slept deeply for the first time since its abandonment, its small chest rising and falling with fragile hope. The mother bobcat rested her chin near it, her eyes half closed but alert. She couldn't name the impulse that had driven her to save this creature, But for now, it was hers to protect. A miracle born in the wild, where rules were meant to break. The San Juan Mountains woke to a dawn cloaked in grey, the air heavy with the scent of impending rain. In the bobcat's den, tucked beneath the granite overhang, the fragile peace of the previous night held, but only just. The mother bobcat lay curled around her two kittens, their spotted fur blending with hers in a tangle of warmth. Beside them, the French bulldog puppy, still unnamed, a tiny creature of cream and shadow, nestled close, its small body pressed against the larger kitten's side. The den was a haven, lined with dry grass and softened by the mother's care, but the morning light revealed a truth the darkness had hidden. The puppy was fading. Its breathing, shallow and uneven, betrayed a hunger and weakness that no amount of warmth could cure. The bobcat's amber eyes, sharp with a mother's vigilance, lingered on the puppy, her tail twitching with an unease she couldn't shake. The night had been a miracle, a fleeting suspension of the wild's harsh laws. The puppy had slept soundly, soothed by the kitten's purring and the bobcat's grooming, its matted coat now cleaner, though still tangled with traces of forest mud. But miracles couldn't fill empty bellies, and as the first rays of light crept into the den, the limits of instinct began to surface. The bobcat rose, stretching her lithe frame, and slipped out to hunt, her absence brief but purposeful. She returned with a rabbit, its limp form dangling from her jaws, and dropped it before her kittens. They pounced eagerly, their sharp teeth tearing into the meat with practiced enthusiasm. The puppy stirred at the commotion, its dark eyes blinking open as it struggled to its feet, drawn by the scent of food. It tottered toward the rabbit, its stubby legs trembling with effort, and nosed at the prey, driven by a hunger it didn't know how to sate. But its blunt muzzle and soft gums were no match for raw meat. It pawed helplessly, letting out a frustrated whimper that cut through the den's quiet. The kittens paused, tilting their heads at the strange creature's struggle. But the bobcat's gaze darkened. She stepped forward, nudging the puppy gently, her nose brushing its side as if to comfort it. Instinctively, the puppy turned to her, seeking the milk it craved, its small mouth searching her belly. She allowed it for a moment, her body still as the puppy's futile suckling tugged at her heart. But she had no milk for a creature not her own. Her kittens had weaned months ago, and biology drew a line her compassion couldn't cross. The bobcat paced the den's entrance, her movements restless, her ears flicking at every sound from the forest beyond. Her kittens, sated from their meal, returned to the puppy, nudging it with playful curiosity. The larger kitten, the bold male, flopped beside it, offering warmth, while his sister batted gently at its tail. The puppy managed a weak wag, its spirit unbroken despite its body's betrayal, and for a moment the scene was almost idyllic, a family bound not by blood but by something softer, something rare. Yet the bobcat knew what the kittens did not. This harmony couldn't last. The puppy's whimpers grew softer, its movements slower as dehydration and starvation tightened their grip. Her own young needed her strength, her focus. She couldn't afford to pour it into a creature doomed by its differences. She stood over the puppy, her shadow falling across its small form, and a low rumble rose in her throat. Not a growl, but a sound of conflict, of a mother torn between love and logic. She'd saved this creature, carried it to safety, cleaned its wounds, but she couldn't keep it alive. The wild demanded balance, and she felt it in her bones. The puppy belonged to another world, one of human hands and fires, not claws and dens. As the morning deepened, the forest stirred with the first drops of rain, a soft patter that whispered of the storm Elias Carter had sensed. The bobcat's ears swiveled, catching a distant scent on the breeze, faint but unmistakable. Wood smoke. The tang of metal, the musk of a human nearby. Her hackles rose instinctively. She'd learned to avoid humans, their traps, their noise. But the scent sparked a memory, a path to a possibility she hadn't considered until now. With a decisiveness that belied her inner turmoil, the bobcat leaned down and gripped the puppy by its scruff once more. Its body went limp, trusting as ever, though its warmth was fainter now, its pulse a fragile thread. She stepped out of the den, her kittens mewing in protest, but she didn't look back. The forest was waking, alive with the rustle of leaves and the calls of jays, but she moved with purpose, her steps silent and sure. She didn't head deeper into the wilderness, where her kind thrived in shadow, but toward its edge, where the trees thinned and the meadow began. The human scent grew stronger, mingling with another, canine, old, familiar in its own way. The bobcat's heart beat faster, but she pressed on, the puppy a precious weight in her jaws. Elias Carter, meanwhile, had been searching since dawn. The whimper he'd heard the previous morning had stopped, leaving him with a nagging worry that drove him beyond his usual paths. With Mabel limping at his side, her arthritic hips slowing her pace, he'd combed the forest's edge, calling out into the silence. "Hello? Anybody there?" His voice echoed unanswered, swallowed by the pines, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Mabel, sensing his urgency, had stayed close, her brindle coat catching burrs as she nosed through the underbrush. Now, as rain began to speckle his jacket, Elias spotted movement in a clearing ahead, a flash of tawny fur, low and deliberate. His hand went to the pocket knife he carried, more habit than intent, but Mabel's stillness stopped him. She stood rigid, ears perked, her brown eyes fixed on the figure emerging from the trees. The bobcat paused at the clearing's edge, her amber eyes locking onto Elias with an intensity that rooted him in place. In her jaws hung the French Bulldog puppy, its body limp but alive, its cream coat stark against her spotted fur. Elias's breath caught, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. "Lord above," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. The bobcat held his gaze unblinking, then carefully lowered the puppy onto a patch of damp moss. She stood over it for a moment, her body taut with protectiveness, before giving it one final lick, a mother's farewell. Then, with a slow step, backward she retreated, her eyes never leaving Elias until she was certain he understood. "You're giving him to me," Elias said softly, awe softening his words. The bobcat's ear twitched, and with a final glance at the puppy, she turned and vanished into the forest, a ghost reclaimed by the wild. Elias knelt, his knees creaking, and reached for the puppy, its warmth faint but real. "You're safe now, little one," he promised, tucking it inside his jacket. Mabel sniffed cautiously, her tail wagging once, and together they turned toward home, the rain falling harder now, as if washing the world clean. Rain fell steadily over the San Juan Mountains, cloaking the valley in a silver veil as Elias Carter trudged back to his cabin, the French Bulldog puppy cradled inside his flannel jacket. The tiny creature's warmth was faint against his chest, its breathing shallow but stubborn, a flicker of life that refused to fade. Mabel, his brindle-coated French bulldog, limped beside him, her arthritic hips protesting the wet ground, but her brown eyes alert, as if she understood the urgency of their mission. The forest whispered around them, its pines swaying under the storm's weight, but Elias's focus was singular. Get the puppy to safety, warm it, feed it, save it. The bobcat's amber eyes lingered in his mind, her deliberate act of trust a puzzle he couldn't yet unravel, but one he felt bound to honor. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and wood smoke. Elias kicked the door shut, rain dripping from his jacket as he moved to the wood stove. Mabel shook herself, sending droplets across the floor, and settled on her quilt, watching with quiet curiosity. Elias knelt by the stove, gently easing the puppy onto a folded towel. Its cream-colored coat was matted, its bat-like ears drooping, and its dark eyes, though open, were clouded with exhaustion. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured, brushing a thumb over its small head. The puppy's tongue flicked weakly, grazing his finger, and Elias felt a pang, a memory of Clara, her hands steady as she nursed a stranded fawn years ago, her voice soft with hope. He worked methodically, drawing on skills honed by decades in the wild. From the kitchen he fetched a mason jar, mixing warm water with a pinch of sugar and salt, a ranger's trick for rehydration when nothing else was at hand. Using a clean cloth, he dripped the solution into the puppy's mouth, careful not to overwhelm it. The puppy swallowed, its throat bobbing, and Elias exhaled, relief loosening the knot in his chest. He wrapped it in another towel, tucking it close to the stove's heat, and sat back on his heels. Mabel edged closer, her broad nose sniffing. The newcomer before she flopped beside the towel, her warmth an unspoken offer of guardianship. "Good girl, Mabel," Elias said, scratching her ears. The old dog's tail thumped once, her approval clear. Hours passed, the storm rattling the cabin's windows as Elias tended the puppy. He offered tiny bits of softened kibble from Mabel's stash, mashed with water to make it easier to swallow. The puppy, whom he'd started calling Pip, for the spark of life in its eyes, began to revive, its movements stronger, its whimpers less desperate. By evening, it managed to lap at a shallow dish of water, its stubby tail wagging faintly. Elias watched, his weathered face softening into a smile. "You're gonna make it, Pip," he said, and for the first time in years the cabin felt less empty, its silence filled with the soft sounds of life. As Pip grew stronger over the next few days, Elias's thoughts kept circling back to the Bobcat. He'd seen plenty in his ranger days, bears fishing in streams, elk clashing antlers under starlight, but never anything like this. A predator saving prey, carrying it to a human for care, went against every rule he knew. Sitting by the fire one night, Pip curled in a cardboard box beside Mabel. Elias let his mind wander. 20 years ago, during a wildfire that scorched half the valley, he'd found a bobcat kitten trapped in a burned-out hollow. Against protocol, he'd taken it home, feeding it milk from a dropper until a wildlife center could take over. He'd released it back to these mountains, never knowing if it survived. Could it be the same bloodline, some cosmic debt repaid? The thought stretched coincidence, but the symmetry felt right, like the wild had its own way of balancing scales. Pip's recovery was swift, his personality blooming as his strength returned. By the second week, he was toddling after Mabel, nipping at her tail with a boldness that made her huff in mock indignation. Elias took him to a vet in Durango, a gruff woman named Dr. Lopez, who confirmed Pip was about 7 weeks old, malnourished, but healthy otherwise. "Someone dumped him," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Purebred French Bulldog, probably too much trouble for whoever had him." Elias nodded, his jaw set. He'd seen abandoned pets before, cats left in barns, dogs tied to trees, but none rescued by a wild animal. "Their bobcat brought him to me," he told her, expecting skepticism. Dr. Lopez raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Stranger things have happened out here," she said, scratching Pip's ears. "This one's lucky to have you both, Winter, settled over the San Juans, blanketing the meadow in snow." Pip grew into his paws, his cream coat gleaming under Elias's care. Unlike most dogs, he showed no fear of the forest, often sitting at the cabin's edge, gazing into the trees as if waiting. Elias watched him, wondering if Pip sensed the bobcat's presence, a connection forged in those desperate hours. He'd spotted her tracks once, delicate prints near the woodshed, but she remained a ghost, her role in Pip's story complete, or so he thought. One crisp December morning, Elias woke to find Pip gone from his usual spot by the stove. Mabel sat by the door, her brown eyes calm but expectant. "Where's our boy, Mabel?" Elias asked, pulling on his boots. Outside, 3 inches of fresh snow covered the ground, and Pip's small paw prints led toward the forest. Heart pounding, Elias followed, calling Pip's name. At the tree line, he stopped short. There was Pip sitting still as stone, facing the woods. Across a small clearing, the mother bobcat stood, her amber eyes glowing in the pale light. Her kittens, now lanky and nearly grown, flanked her, their curiosity mirroring their mother's quiet intensity. Elias held his breath, afraid to disrupt the moment. Pip's tail swept a slow arc in the snow, not frantic but deliberate, a greeting across the divide. The bobcat stepped forward, closing the gap to a few feet, then lowered herself into a crouch, her gaze steady on Pip. From the brush, the kittens emerged, circling him with the same cautious playfulness they'd shown in the den. They touched noses, a silent reunion that defied explanation. Elias watched, his throat tight, knowing he was witnessing something sacred, a bond not of instinct alone, but of recognition, of gratitude. After long minutes, the bobcat chirped softly, calling her kittens back. With a final look at Pip, she led them into the forest, their forms dissolving into shadow. Pip sat until they were gone, then trotted to Elias, pressing against his leg. "You've got kin out there, Pip," Elias said, kneeling to ruffle his ears. Spring brought wildflowers to the meadow, and Pip, now sturdy and bold, joined Elias and Mabel on hikes, his nose catching scents Mabel ignored. The cabin hummed with life, its once quiet corners filled with purpose. On a May morning, as they reached a clearing where columbines bloomed, Elias saw her again. The Bobcat, alone now, watching from a ridge. She held his gaze, then slipped away, her work done. "Thank you," Elias whispered, Pip warm against his side, the wild's miracle alive in them both.